Hello everyone, and welcome to your training on fraud, waste, and abuse. For this training session, you're going to be completing an activity that's simply titled Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Activity. And it looks like this. So you'll complete this as the video that we're going to watch plays and as we go through the PowerPoint slides. So let's jump into the video. This video is going to explain to all of us how fraud, waste, and abuse really affects the United States. So give me one moment as I prepare to share this video. Okay, here we go.
In the United States today, we spend approximately $3.8 trillion on health care. There's no way to accurately determine the amount of healthcare fraud and abuse in that $3.8 trillion. However, current estimates suggest that approximately $100 billion to $450 billion is a reasonable number to assume relates to bad claims that are filed within the healthcare industry. The effect of that $100 billion to $450 billion on an annual basis is dramatic to insurance companies and insureds because the insurance companies see an increased cost of doing business, which means their profits are going down, their costs are going up. They translate that into higher premiums for their insureds. So the insureds see higher premiums, they see higher deductibles. In many cases, they see lower coverages, which is a huge concern, and even gravitates towards families who have to make a decision on whether they can afford to have health insurance because of the higher prices that are a direct result of the healthcare fraud and abuse number that we see on an annual basis in the United States. Healthcare fraud in the United States is committed by both healthcare providers and individuals. Some examples of fraud committed by providers include billing for services that are not medically necessary, billing for services that weren't actually performed, and billing for services that are more expensive than what may actually be prescribed by your condition. It is a continued problem that is uncovered oftentimes by data analytics, whistleblowers, or people who are reporting incidents of healthcare fraud and abuse. And it is a problem that is growing and has grown in nature. It is a problem that has been addressed to some degree by the Affordable Care Act, which mandates greater attention be given to healthcare fraud and abuse in the United States. And the fact that we now have a $100 to $400 billion healthcare fraud and abuse problem suggests that we continue to focus on this at a much greater rate than we have in the past.
Okay, so I hope that you learned a lot by watching that video. I know that I definitely learned a lot of things I didn't know when I watched that video. Okay, so now we have a PowerPoint to go over with a lot of the main information about fraud, waste, and abuse, and what you need to know about fraud, waste, and abuse in your workplace. So bear with me while I pull up the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so let's jump into fraud, waste, and abuse and find out what it's all about. Fraud. So there's some differences between fraud, waste, and abuse. So we'll start with fraud. Fraud is knowingly and willfully executing or attempting to execute a scheme let me see if I can move myself. There we go. A scheme to defraud any healthcare benefit program or to obtain by means of false or fraudulent pretenses, representations, or promises any of the money or property owned by or under the custody or control of any healthcare benefit program. For example, filing a claim for services that were never performed in any capacity. Waste is the overutilization of services or other practices that directly or indirectly result in necessary costs to the healthcare system, including the Medicare and Medicaid programs. It is not generally considered to be caused by criminally negligent actions, but rather by the misuse of resources. An example would be writing a high-cost prescription over a lower-cost generic, not out of necessity. Abuse includes any actions that may directly or indirectly result in one or more of the following: unnecessary cost to the healthcare system, improper payment for services that fail to meet professionally recognized standards of care, services that are not medically necessary. For example, billing for 1 hour visit when the visit was only 15 minutes. So these definitions are sometimes hard to understand or separate or differentiate. So I hope that the examples on the bottom sort of help you understand the difference between fraud, waste, and abuse. So what are the differences between them? One of the primary differences is intent and knowledge. Fraud requires the person to have intent to obtain payment and the knowledge that their actions are wrong. Waste and abuse may involve obtaining an improper payment, but does not necessarily require intent or knowledge. So laws, I'm trying to move this box that I see. There we go, so I can read the slides. Okay, laws and federal laws. False Claim Act, also called FCA, protects the government from being overcharged or sold substandard goods or services. FCA imposes civil liability on any person who knowingly submits a false claim to the government. Anti-kickback statute, AKS. The AKS makes it a criminal offense to knowingly and willfully offer or receive any remuneration, that's a word I can never say, directly or indirectly to induce or reward referrals or items of services reimbursable by a federal health care program. Physician self-referral law is called the Stark Law. This prohibits a physician from making a referral for certain designated health services to an entity in which the physician has an ownership, investment, or interest. Now, that's a mouthful, but these three laws basically just set up some standards to help protect people who, like the healthcare system or owners, just protect people from being able to commit fraud, waste, and abuse. So, recognizing occurrences. Questions to ask yourself. Do the signatures look altered or forged? Are there numerous requests for this person from different doctors? Is the service appropriate based on medical history or other notes and details? Is the provider writing a higher quantity of referrals than medically necessary for any given condition? Is the provider performing unnecessary services? Or do you see prescriptions being altered? Reporting fraud, waste, and abuse. So report any concern immediately. The compliance department will investigate every claim and decide if it is fraud, waste, or abuse. The Code of Ethics and Conduct outlines your obligation to report and that you are protected from making any good faith report. Anonymous and confidential reports must be accepted by all employers, and employers cannot retaliate. Direct any suspicion of fraud, waste, or abuse to your direct supervisor. Violations must be corrected immediately. Consequences for committing fraud, waste, and abuse could be civil money penalties, criminal conviction fines, civil prosecution, imprisonment, loss of provider license, and exclusion from federal healthcare programs. How does fraud, waste, and abuse affect me? Well, without programs to prevent or detect and correct non-compliance, you risk higher premiums, lower benefits for individuals and employers, higher co-payments, and lower profits for employers. If you'd like to watch that video again, here's the link. So that concludes our lesson and training on fraud, waste, and abuse. We're almost to the end. We have one more section on sexual harassment and violence in the workplace, and then we'll conclude everything in a small video where I tell you how to get your certificates of completion, and then you'll be done. So I'll see you in the very last training video, which will be on sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. Okay, I'll see you then.